Welcome to another episode within the series, Exploring Careers and Conflict Transformation. My name is Tianse Allison. I am a rising junior at Middlebury College, and it is my pleasure to introduce this episode's guest speaker. I'm joined today by Rachel Sider, Middlebury class of 2014 and head of the executive office at Interpeace in Geneva. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Tianse. Great to be here.
So, Rachel, this series explores a number of different professional roles in the field of conflict transformation. Can you tell us a little bit about Interpeace and the work you do as it fits into the conflict transformation career space?
Sure. So I'll actually start by explaining a little bit about how Interpeace came to be and how that shapes the work that Interpeace does in terms of conflict transformation. So it's an organization that started about 30 years ago in reaction to a challenge the international community was having in the early 90s, when a number of different countries from Guatemala to Eritrea to Mozambique to Somalia were experiencing their own forms of internal conflict, their own non-state armed conflicts and civil wars. And we're just starting to emerge from a lot of these civil wars. And we're struggling with how to figure out the best ways of easing themselves out of conflict and to implement the peace negotiations or the peace agreements that had been reached. And the international community was specifically struggling with how to configure its role in relation to these various intrastate conflicts. And Interpeace's work, therefore, was very much focused on trying to bridge the gaps in understanding, the gaps in expertise, between those who were involved in the conflict from within that society and those who were coming in from the outside, whether that's the United Nations or other governments that were intervening or who were supporting a peace process or who were undertaking development initiatives, but may not have been able to configure their support in a way that would best transform that conflict and pave the way for sustainable peace. And so Interpeace's role has, of course, evolved over those past 30 years, but a lot of what its focus has been to really support both a society's own ability to manage and respond to conflict in a nonviolent and non-coercive way by working with community members, national governments, members of civil society. But at the same time, to support the international community in understanding and calibrating their role so as to support that society's own path towards peace. And a lot of that has been pursued through a series of both policy initiatives and in-country programs that help to support, as locally led and as locally driven, a response to conflict as is possible in whatever context we might find ourselves in. And it's meant that Interpeace has evolved in its work across Latin America, Central and Central America, as well as across the African continent and parts of Eastern Asia as well.
Thank you so much for kind of setting up that scene of what Interpeace does and the really unique angle that it's in terms of having that local emphasis while still having, as you mentioned, a very large role in the international community at large. And so along those lines, I'm just curious as to what the process is of kind of monitoring the efficacy of the peace building process, since you are working with people on the ground, it seems. How do you ensure that the vision that you guys set up in this international and local structure, how is that best pursued?
Yeah. I think one of the challenges that we often find is that even measuring progress towards peace is itself very context specific, and understanding where a society is in its own evolution or its own journey, as we might call it, really starts with having a very good diagnosis of the problem, right? So the first tool that we often rely on in our peace building approaches, especially at the local and the national level, is what's called participatory action research. And this is a really exciting methodology because what it does is it actually helps us to get a snapshot through the eyes of members of society themselves as to what are some of the challenges, the tensions, the conflict factors that would contribute to devolution into violence that have for a while maybe led to cycles of protracted conflict over a long period of time, that have seeded grievances that are maybe historical or have legacies that will affect the future. And using what's called participatory action research as a way of getting that snapshot, and then using that as a baseline for understanding how a society might evolve much more towards peace in the future. If we don't have that baseline, it's very difficult then to build quality programs that then we can measure and then we can really understand the efficacy of, right? So that's the first step. I think the second step also is about trying to measure within that baseline, what are some of the factors of resilience that might exist? What are some of the factors that might help us to know whether we can reinforce trust, understanding, social cohesion within or between different groups of people, maybe between the state and society or within society itself? And measuring those factors of resilience then helps us, if we were to do that and measure that longitudinally over time, we would be able to understand the efficacy of some of the peace building approaches. So those are two different ways of thinking about measurement. But I think the other thing to think about in all of this is that it's very difficult to isolate what's the impact of some of the work that we might be undertaking in isolation relative to the work that's playing out by so many other actors in the space at a given point in time, right? So that's humanitarian agencies who are delivering services and aid. That's maybe longer term development programs conducted by the World Bank or other financial institutions, or even the work that the state might be undertaking to reform its own governance structures, right? And so that's part of the challenge with measuring the efficacy of peace building much more broadly, is we need to be doing this at scale. We need to be looking at this through the eyes of a single society or a given context, particularly at the national level, and then knowing how our very own contributions as Interpeace or as other actors might contribute to that much bigger picture. But because of that dual function that I described that we fulfill in our mandate, both supporting societies and more locally driven approaches to peace building, as well as helping the international community, specifically the UN, calibrate its role, we end up interacting a huge amount with both of those different constituencies, if you might call it that. And what that means is that we're very often engaging with those who are directly impacted by conflict, those who might be party to the conflict, or those who are bystanders and feel their implications on a day-to-day basis as civilians, but also those that are at different levels within the political process that are required to resolve those conflicts. So in the peace building space, you know, there are different levels or tracks, as we call them, to engaging in resolving conflict. And at the track 1 level, that means we're interacting a huge amount with state officials, with national authorities who have the sovereignty and the mandate to be undertaking peace negotiations at the country level. But then we're also engaging at the other 2 tracks, right? Track 2, which means a lot of civil society actors, whether that's the media, grassroots, women's organizations, youth associations, faith leaders, tribal leaders, whatever that might look like in a given context. And then the 3rd level is much more at the community or society level, right? And all of those tracks are equally important and might play a role in conflict transformation. And in working across those different levels, we're able to hopefully reinforce resilience that already exists and advance peace on a much more systemic level. In my own role, this means that I'm interacting a fair amount with our country-based colleagues who are leading this work in specific contexts, from Mali and Burkina Faso to Libya and Yemen, all the way to Somalia and Ethiopia. But also outside of Interpeace, also trying to support the positioning of the organization in what we would call international Geneva. Geneva is a capital for peace processes. It's also a humanitarian capital. And there's a lot of coordination that has to happen with agencies, funds, and programs of the United Nations, with other peace building peers who are critical to this mosaic of actors who reinforce our work, who help us do the work that we do, who are able to take it in different directions, as well as you mentioned humanitarian and development actors, where there's a growing conversation about the complementarity and the interlinkages between these different groups of organizations who might all have different skill sets and expertise and mandates, but are all at the end of the day trying to help a society gain self-reliance and achieve a much longer term trajectory of development. And in working between the humanitarian, development, and peace actors, we're able to see some of those linkages reinforced and much stronger outcomes for the communities that we're all really here to be supporting.
You may have touched on this, but I'm just curious if you could elaborate more on what specifically you do in your role as head of the executive office, as well as what you find most challenging and most interesting about your work.
Sure. So as head of the executive office, my role is to support the executive office, which consists of the president and the vice president of the organization, in the strategic oversight of the work that Interpeace is doing at the global level, from setting our 5-year strategy and our annual work plan and supporting colleagues across the organization to deliver upon those strategic goals, to reinforcing the good governance of the organization by helping to curate our biannual global governing board meetings and anything in between. A lot of it involves coordination, both within the organization with the different teams and departments that are doing the day-to-day peace building, but are also managing the budgets and the systems and the processes that keep the work that we're doing going. A lot of it's about relationship management and helping to support and connect the dots within the organization about how we develop relationships with strategic donors of ours, whether that's certain governments who fund the projects and the work that we do, or it's peer peace building organizations who are part of this ecosystem of partners and allies in supporting this type of work. And a lot of the work, I would say, really revolves around effective communication, both within the organization, but also to the outside, about how and why we undertake the peace building approach that we do, what it leads to in terms of impact with communities, and most importantly, how we can influence peace building policy and practice at a much more global scale. So some of the challenges with that, I would say, are that you're often juggling a whole lot of different aspects on a given day, because when you're sitting really at the core of some of the biggest challenges that the organization is facing, you're having to both problem solve very quickly and react to some emergencies that might pop up, but you're also having to make sure that the low burning or slow burning issues, such as our annual strategy, are also followed and implemented, right? And juggling between the reactive and the much longer term proactive work is one of those challenges. I would say a second challenge is probably the distance that we can often feel from the day-to-day impact of the peace building work, right? I think compared to some of the past work I was doing much more on the humanitarian policy side, peace building takes a long time. And the results of peace building may only bear fruit in a decade or several decades time, right? And if you're sitting in Geneva, supporting the day-to-day work of an organization towards those outcomes, sometimes the impact can feel a bit distant. Sometimes it doesn't feel as dynamic as some of the other sectors that also have a role to play in conflict-affected settings. But at the same time, it also speaks to, I think, one of the biggest strengths of peace building and the work that I get to be a part of, which is the intention behind peace building. It's the thoughtfulness, it's the clarity about why and what we're pursuing and for whom. And I think, unlike a lot of the other actors who might be rushing into a conflict in an emergency to provide aid to those who might have been just yesterday displaced, peace builders take with them a bit more conscientiousness in approach that I think leads to much more sustainable and impactful outcomes over the longer term.
I am just curious, given our current global and political landscape, how you view your work being reshaped going towards the future, just given conflicts that are currently arising, that are ongoing in places across the world, just how you see your focus having to be reshifted and how it's already been reshaped in your time at Interpeace thus far.
Yes, I think this is the question that all peacebuilding organizations are grappling with at the moment. And I think you can look at it a couple of different ways, right? I think on the one hand, the war in Ukraine in particular, but I think also the lack of trust that has been laid bare, and the inequality that has been both laid bare and reinforced by the pandemic, by the sentiment of a double standard in many African contexts, especially towards the West, but also the reactions that we've seen in various multilateral spaces towards the war in Ukraine, I think all raise a lot of questions about how can we resolve conflict when one state chooses to invade another, but also where is the relevance of peace-building actors when states themselves can't get along. And I think this has posed a lot of reflections for the peace-building community. First, I think it has helped to reinforce some of the long-standing shortcomings of how peace processes and mediation have been understood and approached historically. Things like the fact that there was an assumption that you can impose or import a peace process from the outside, if you just bring the right people around a table, that it all can be sorted out. I think that's a myth that's been kind of reinforced and proven otherwise. I think secondly, this has shown us that many of the spaces on which we've relied to resolve conflict at the highest levels of politics, whether it's the UN Security Council or elsewhere, that those are some of the most divided spaces politically, where we see states really entrenched on issues that didn't used to have the same degree of contention. And what that's meant is that it's challenged us to look beyond some of these spaces at other ways of trying to influence the peace process, about influencing who should be around a negotiating table. How can we have influence maybe outside of the track one level to unlock progress at those high level political realms? And what that means is that I think it gives us an opportunity to look much more at where those grievances have long been felt but not heard, where voices that were not necessarily rendered audible, let alone influential, might be able to shape a political process or a policy process at a multilateral level. And I think it also poses questions about the role of specific actors who we've for a very long time put at the center of conflict transformation, the role of the UN and the role of other multilateral fora. And perhaps just to conclude, I think this also gives us a chance to really rethink some of the approaches that we've relied on, and to look beyond those traditional spaces of resolving grievances and to listen to those who for a very long time have been marginalized from these spaces of power. That means that some of the conversations that used to be happening about the reform of the UN system are back on the table. You look at the work of the UN Secretary General when it comes to our common agenda and the new peace-building architecture reforms that are being considered, that it poses some opportunities, I think, to reflect on what has failed, but also to make sure that we're learning from those failings and we're baking in changes to the system that can reflect some of the values that Interpeace has long espoused. That's participation, that's inclusion, that's solidarity, that's a respect for what maybe some would call localization or subsidiarity, and that those values are much more infused in the traditional systems on which we've long relied.
I'm curious about, as I said, your own experience from campus to career. So I know that at Mid, you majored in political science and Middle East studies. And so I'm hoping you can just tell us more about the rest of your story.
Sure. So that's a long one. And I know I don't want to bore our audience with all of the details, but I have to say that a lot of my career was shaped by my decision to study both language at Middlebury, so to study Arabic, but also to focus on on a region that became, I think, really important geopolitically while I was a student, and that was the Middle East. And this was at a time when the Arab Spring was just unfolding, where there was a recognition that there was both a lot of promise and opportunity with the uprisings that were just starting to break out across the region. But there was also a failure to learn from some previous US foreign policy decisions that made engaging in this very region all the more challenging and difficult. And my trajectory after Middlebury, I think, was partially shaped by this time period in which I was studying, where there were some massive humanitarian crises that had broken out both in Syria, but also in Iraq, where I later worked. And where, as a student, I felt like there was a real lack of clarity as to the role of humanitarian organizations at the earliest onset of some of these emergencies relative to the undertakings of national authorities. And so a lot of my early years as a humanitarian policy lead with a couple of big NGOs really focused on that question, which was, what do you do in a context where you have a sudden onset emergency, where the international community propels itself into a context, often lack of consideration for local expertise and knowledge or awareness even of previous humanitarian responses? And how do you build a humanitarian response that is as effective and reflective of the needs of the population that is caught up in the conflict? And so I ended up coming out of Mid and securing a series of jobs, largely thanks to some recommendations and some advice of some previous Middlebury alumni who were able to guide me on a path of what was really focused on humanitarian policy influencing and looking at a couple of specific emergency responses in the Middle East. I would say also this career was shaped by the proficiency in Arabic, which I developed at Middlebury, but also an awareness that I wanted to be shaping not just the nature of the response that was taking place in Iraq, Palestine, Syria, Jordan, but also could be influencing the policies of governments that were themselves committing foreign aid and assistance in many of these contexts, but were lacking a lot of the cultural knowledge, context specificity, and awareness of the nature of the response itself to shape those responses in as effective a manner as possible. So I was able to draw, I think, a fair amount too on both the political science background that I was able to develop through some of my coursework, but also with the work that Middlebury was just starting to launch at the DC level to be much more well-positioned in both the DC context as well as in the Middle East itself.
So I'm just curious in terms of any extracurriculars that you found at Middlebury, or whether that be summer opportunities, things that helped you really find that niche felt most true to you.
Yes, I have to say that I think it was things like Juntos and working with the Juntos migrant worker community in rural Vermont that helped me, I think, appreciate the understanding of the impact that this could have on a very individual level when you're caught up in injustice, when you're caught up in economic, political, or social inequality, when you're finding yourself uprooted and displaced overnight without any warning as to what might cause that. All of those, I think, helped me define a sense of social justice, but also solidarity with the populations that are mostly affected by these crises. And also, I think, an awareness that we each have a specific positionality in this space. And specifically when I was studying abroad at Middlebury in Jordan, this became really acute because I was volunteering in the Zaatari refugee camp, which today is still Jordan's largest Syrian refugee camp, but even at the time was a growing place of despair, of destitution, of displacement for some of the earliest refugees from what was then still very much a revolution in Syria. And what became very clear in that response and in my own role as a volunteer was, the ability to enter and exit the camp as a foreigner when Syrians themselves were unable to, the lack of freedom of movement of the displaced population who had already suffered a fair amount of disruption in their lives, to put it lightly, to then find themselves once again in a situation where they were deprived of their freedom of movement, I think was a real eye-awakening moment for me to really understand, all right, humanitarian aid and humanitarian policy has an ability to influence, right? It has an ability to meet needs, whether that's shelter, food, health, or education, but also the nature of that aid and the way in which it's delivered also has an impact on the fulfillment of rights. And it was through that volunteering opportunity that I was able to have that realization, but I think also appreciate that I could play a role in trying to resolve some of that myself. And it took a long time to figure out exactly what that looked like, practically speaking, in terms of the roles that I could occupy at a specific NGO or another. But it helped me kind of appreciate that at the end of the day, if we're not developing programs, policies, solutions in these conflict settings that are grounded in the realities of those who are going through them, we're not going to succeed.
And so I'm just curious if you can speak to what role, if any, do advanced degrees or certain certifications play in the conflict transformation space? What would those interested in pursuing this career arena, if there are things that could kind of check a box for them almost in pursuing this line of work that you found relevant in your own experience?
So I think the challenge is that peace building is a very multidisciplinary exercise. And that's both a challenge because it means that we need to be coming at this problem from so many different angles, but it's also a real opportunity for those who may not have necessarily thought that they had to study conflict transformation, can still pick up some useful skills. So I think one way to think about this is actually the peace building in many senses is trying to cut across so many of the silos that are reinforced by the individual mandates or disciplines or sectors that our education might reinforce, right? And what's really useful is to have a combination of skill sets within any organization that's trying to undertake this work that both speak to the generalism that's required to effectively manage programs, to be thinking in a multidisciplinary way, to be addressing multidimensional problems with multidimensional solutions, all of which I'd say are really reinforced and advanced through a liberal arts curriculum. But at the same time, to have experts on hand who can really do the meat and potatoes of the peace building in a way that can accompany societies that might not have those skill sets. And I think this is where the injection of expertise and knowledge and support from the outside in support of a locally led, locally driven process can be very useful. And it's often, some of our most senior expert peace building advisors that we call upon to play that role. And these are people who have had advanced education, certifications, and extensive experience in conflict transformation that enables them to play that role, and then enables them to often be a bridge between a community that's struggling to find its solutions and the big high-level policymakers who may often have the political will but don't have that peace building expertise and the toolbox that's required to be able to implement the right solution for that given context. And I'd say that's one way of really gaining the expertise. But I would also say that it's not the be-all end-all. If you're coming at this line of work as someone who hasn't yet developed that specialization or is contemplating it, that there are several different angles that you can take to be able to play a contributing role in conflict transformation, whether it's with an organization like Interpeace or someone that's working at this and from a different angle.
So I'm just curious, as almost some closing points, just given your experiences and what you know now, thinking back to your time as just a Middlebury graduate at first, what advice can you give to current students on how to best prepare themselves for entry points into this career field?
Yes, this is the perennial challenge. I think you're absolutely right. It's not linear. And there are no obvious entry points very often, or there are very few natural entry points. So I think the first thing just to think about is is how can you design your own entry points, and how can a non-traditional entry point into conflict transformation actually lead to you having a position in conflict transformation, because there's so much that's adjacent to the space that might be proximate enough. I think the second piece of advice is, if you're just getting started, there's really no wrong move you can make. There's no wrong step. At some point you need some experience. And I think third is to think about the fact that this is a lifestyle choice as much as it is a career choice. And I think that was something that I failed to understand until I was, 3 years into living in Iraq and realizing that I was very far away from home and on track to live a pretty international career for the longer term. But that comes with both, tremendous rewards, but also some significant challenges in terms of staying close and in touch with family, to building a community outside of the United States, and everything in between.
This concludes this episode within the series Exploring Careers in Conflict Transformation. In closing, I would like to encourage viewers to tune in to get career perspectives and advice from a number of professionals and a broad variety of organizations in our other episodes in the series. I also want to encourage you to tune into the other MIDDVantage series, which can be accessed through the events and programs section on the CCI website. Thank you again for watching.